Hey everyone, and welcome back to By Ramya, where I talk about education, everything, including helping you with your courses. And so today, follow along as I study with you for Unit 2 of AP Environmental Science. Let's get started. If there's a specific concept you want to review, go ahead and view the timestamps or the chapters in this video, and you'll be able to easily jump to any concept that you specifically need to look at. Make sure to like and subscribe if you want to get notified to make your studying life easier and get better grades. Okay, without further ado, let's get started. So we're studying Unit 2. We're first going to talk about probably the most packed chapter, 2.1 of Unit 2. This is Introduction to Biodiversity. To start off, there are four main vocab words you need to know for this specific chapter. The first is ecosystem diversity. What is ecosystem diversity? It's just the diversity in ecosystems. It's the variety of ecosystems we have all around Earth. There's a pond, there's a grassland, etc., etc. Next is genetic diversity. That is within a species. If a human has black hair and another human has brown hair, that would be genetic diversity. Like within a species, or different genes, different traits. And the next two are pretty important and they can be easily confused. They are species richness and species evenness. So these two can be kind of confusing, but don't worry, we are going to figure out exactly how to navigate them. Species richness is the number of species in a given area, while species evenness has more to do with the relative abundance of the species in the area. What does that mean? Let's look at an example. All right, so here we have an example. I want you to just look at the first row here of animals. Tell me, what is the species richness? Remember, the species richness is the number of species in a given area. So if you only look at the first row, the species richness is 3 because there's the elephant, there's a giraffe, there's that cat thing, maybe it's leopard, I don't know exactly what it is, but all you know is that there are 3 species there, right? That's the species richness. Now let's look at species evenness. Species evenness wouldn't necessarily be a number. It would be super complicated math if we actually tried to calculate it. What we can tell, though, is the abundance. We can tell that there are more elephants than giraffes and the cat thingy, right? And so this is not very even. Think of species evenness as just abundance. Okay, there is a lot more elephants than there is anything else. So there is a low biodiversity. All right, now that we've talked about species richness and species evenness, I have a question for you. Human disturbance does what to species evenness and species richness? Pause and answer. The answer is it decreases species evenness and richness because humans disrupt the environment. They decrease the population and they decrease biodiversity. I'm not sure why I'm saying they, we are humans, but we decrease their biodiversity. Next, we're going to talk about micro versus macro evolution. And this is a pretty simple concept, I think. Micro, small, macro, big. Microevolution is evolution on a small scale. It's usually within a population. Maybe there's a few gene mutations within a population. Macroevolution, on the other hand, is large scale. It's long term, and an example of this is speciation, which means a new species evolving. Okay, I have another question for you. Mutations are passed on to offspring when they occur in what? Pause and answer in the comments. The answer is they're passed down to the next generation if mutations occur in the egg or sperm, because those are passed down. Other mutations do not actually get passed down to offspring unless recorded in the egg or sperm. Now, let's talk about the 3 types of evolution. The three types of evolution is artificial selection, natural selection, and random processes. So artificial selection is, for example, dog breeding. It's whenever humans say, I want this trait to be passed on. They control the traits being passed down. It's artificial selection. It's not natural. The second type is natural selection. It's when the environment and nature itself does the selection. An example of this is just over time, let's say the environment of Texas becomes all white. Well, the animals that have adapted and have like white fur may have a better chance of blending in and surviving. And so over time, white fur would become the adaptation for Texas. It's completely unrealistic, but it's an example. Okay, and the third is random processes. Examples of random processes that are a type of evolution are mutation, genetic drift, the bottleneck effect, and the founder effect. More on this when we talk about 2.6. And the last important vocab for you to know is allopatric speciation versus sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation happens when a species gets geographically isolated and then they form separate species. How do you know that they're now separate species? Well, they can't interbreed. They can't interbreed and have offspring, basically. So an example of allopatric speciation is if there are a bunch of frogs on a piece of land, on a piece of land, and this pond became a river and it split the frogs into two different halves of the land. Over time, maybe those frogs would change so much that they evolve into different species. And if the river closes or they meet again, they actually can't produce offspring. And so that's how you know allopatric speciation has happened. Sympatric speciation, on the other hand, happens without geographic isolation. So on the same piece of land, these two species somehow evolve. The same species somehow evolves to become two different species, or maybe more than two different species. All right, and that is it for 2.1. There's still more to come. Next is 2.2. This one is actually pretty brief. It's all about ecosystem services. So what are ecosystem services? They are benefits that humans get from natural ecosystems. So here are the four types of ecosystem services that you need to know: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. Okay, so what does that mean? Provisioning is benefits that humans extract from nature, or goods humans can directly use, for example, lumber, food crops, furs. Basically, whenever we get something from nature and we use it, that would be considered provisioning. Okay, next is regulating. This is pretty simple, just the environment regulating itself. For example, water filtration. We can drink water because the environment actually filters it. Generally, the environment also regulates its climate and temperature. Basically, just the environment regulating itself so that it's sustainable and we can live on Earth. Next is cultural. In my opinion, this is the easiest. This is just intellectual gain or aesthetic satisfaction. So if you look at the coral reefs and you go, whoa, they're so beautiful, natural beauty, that would be aesthetic satisfaction, and that would be a cultural importance for humans. Lastly, we have supporting. Support systems are basically just production of something. So for example, plants undergo photosynthesis and can make glucose and oxygen to support the ecosystem. Another example of support systems would be pollination. All right, and that was it for 2.2. Now let's move on to 2.3. 2.3 is also pretty short. We're just going to be talking about the theory of island biogeography. And trust me, it's actually super easy. This is all it is. Basically, it says there are 4 factors that influence the number of species or the biodiversity. And those 4 factors are: 1, latitude. And this sounds more complicated than it is, because basically this means as you go north of the equator, the number of species declines. So the equator has lots of species, number of species. As you go upwards north, that declines. The second factor is time. As there is more time, or like as this piece of land gets older, there are just going to be more species evolving on it. There's just going to be more species arriving on it. So the older a piece of land, or the more time that passes, the more species will be on it. And so if the number of species increases, the biodiversity also increases. Next, 3, the larger habitats, the more species there's going to be there. And 4, the closer the habitat, the more species will be there. So I have a question for you. Does that mean if I have a smaller habitat, then there's going to be less species compared to a habitat with a larger habitat? The answer is yes, smaller habitats and habitats that are farther away from the mainland are going to just have less species and less biodiversity compared to larger and closer habitats. And that's pretty much all the island biogeography theory is saying. Okay, for 2.4, we're going to be talking about expectations versus reality. Okay, so the expectation is that the average high schooler gets 8 hours of sleep easy, right? The reality is that's not the case. It's more like 4 hours on average, right? Well, the fundamental niche and the realized niche work in the same way. It's expectations versus reality. So you have the fundamental niche that basically has the ideal conditions for a species. You know, this is expectations, everything's perfect, the sun is shining. And then there's a realized niche, the conditions under which a species actually is living in. So it's reality, realized niche, reality, right? And that is pretty much it for fundamental versus realized niche. You need to know that. We'll get to more on that later. But the second piece of vocab you need to know is niche generalist versus niche specialist. So niche generalists can live in a wide range of conditions, right? So their fundamental niche have several different conditions that they can live easily in, while niche specialists can only live in specific specialized habitats. So, for example, humans, we honestly can live in many different habitats in the world, but let's say that there's an organism that can only live in weather at like 0 degrees Fahrenheit. That would have a more specialized niche because there's less places that it can actually live and survive, and the places it lives are more specialized, while a human that can live in more generalized niche, it's a niche generalist, can live almost anywhere. Now let's look at this graph. So right here, we see this is the fundamental niche. It is the ideal conditions for the species. It's also called the range of optimum. Basically, it's generally where you see the most abundance of the species, the greatest number of the species, because it's the best conditions that the species can live in. Think of it as a fundamental niche. But here's the thing. Life isn't always ideal. The realized niche isn't always going to be the fundamental niche. It might actually have harsher conditions on what the organism needs to live. So in the fundamental niche, the organism can easily survive, reproduce, and grow. However, once you get to the zone of physiological stress, you see that the organism can really only just survive in that zone. Like there's not, it's going to have a hard time reproducing. There's going to be low populations. If this is its realized niche, it doesn't have the same conditions as the fundamental niche. And so it finds it hard to live in this zone. That's why you see a low population. And then this is what we also call the range of tolerance, right here to right here. Once you surpass the range of tolerance, you're in the zone of intolerance. The species dies once you get out of the range of tolerance. So the range of tolerance is basically where the species can live. And of course, they want to live in the zone of optimum. It is the optimum, it's the best, it's the fundamental niche. It's what you'd want or expect. And that is it for 2.4. And now it is time to move on to chapter 2.5. And today we'll be talking about resistance versus resilience. So what is resistance? Basically, when a disturbance happens in the ecosystem, and a disturbance could be like a natural disaster, like a hurricane, for example, or a forest fire, really something just affects the ecosystem. The question you have to ask yourself is how much is the ecosystem affected? And if the energy flow in the ecosystem does not change and the NPP, net primary productivity, is the same, we call this a resistant ecosystem or a highly resistant ecosystem. It doesn't change. Let me give you an example. It resists change, basically. Let me try to break my phone. Not really working. It's resisting that change. It's resistant. Okay, now let's talk about resilience. So resilience is the rate that the ecosystem returns to the original state after a disturbance happened. So what this means is, let's say that my phone magically repairs itself after I drop it. Well, we'd call that resilient because it bounces back. If it's highly resilient, this is highly resilient, it returns to the original state rapidly. So resilience is like over a period of time after the disturbance happened, it bounces back, it recovers, it improves. And so how would it have low resilience? Well, if I dropped it and it never fixed itself, then it would be low resilience. And I can testify that it is low resilience because it has a bunch of cracks on it. Anyway, now we're going to go back to 2.5, and this is the last vocab word for this one. It's called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. What this means is that the environment with the most biodiversity is the one with intermediate disturbances. So if you have a question on a test that's like true or false, if there was no disturbance of this ecosystem, it would be the most biodiverse. The answer would be no. And that is it for 2.5. All right, guys, we are almost done. Now let's go to 2.6. This won't take too long, but before we actually do that, I have a bonus question for you that might show up on an FAQ someday. It's just good to know. My question is, what are 5 ways that humans have disrupted the ecosystem? Pause the video and answer. Climate change, pollution, habitat destruction, overexploitation of resources, invasive species being introduced. Okay, now let's move on to 2.6. We're going to be talking about the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. The bottleneck effect happens when there's a sharp reduction in a population, and that changes the genetic composition of a species, usually because of a natural disaster. So let's say a volcano erupts, and there is a bunch of mice in the vicinity of this volcano eruption. Well, almost all of the mice that were hit by the magma and the lava were the white mice, while all the black mice survived the eruption. That means that now, because of this volcano eruption, the majority of the living species are now black mice, and this is going to continue for a long time. Black mice will just become the dominant traits of the species because some event happened that just drastically altered the population and shifted the traits in one way. And so that's the bottleneck effect. Okay, so for the founder effect, think about this. Let's say you and your family set out to start a new colony in a random new island that was found. Well, the traits that will be in that island are going to predominantly be your family's traits, right? There's going to be low biodiversity because only the founding members' traits are going to be carried into the descendants of the island. So this is just what we call the founder effect. Basically, the people, the organisms who established the colony are going to be the ones, like pretty much the only traits that the islanders are going to have. Lastly, for this chapter, we're going to talk about genetic drift. The definition of genetic drift is a change in the frequency of an allele within a population over time. Basically, to give you an example of this, let's say there's a population of kangaroos. There are red kangaroos and orange kangaroos. By chance, all the new kangaroos produced in the new generation ended up being orange. And this means that just because of random chance, this new allele, the orange fur, is going to be the dominant trait for kangaroos. Genetic drift is basically just the random change in the frequency in an allele or a trait over time. Wow, we're almost done. Let's go to 2.7. Lastly, we have 2.7, all about ecological succession. Let's define ecological succession. Ecological succession is the predictable replacement of one group of species by another group of species over time. So let's talk about the 2 types of succession. There's primary and there's secondary succession. Think of primary as 1, secondary as 2. The main distinction, how you'll be able to tell if it's primary or secondary, is simply, is there soil? It's that simple. So basically, if there's a little or no soil, you're going to know that's primary succession. But if there's still soil in that ecosystem after whatever disaster or disruption occurred, that's going to be secondary succession. An important vocab word to note is what pioneer species means. Pioneer species is basically the first colonizer. For primary succession, the first colonizers or the pioneer species are going to be lichen, moss, and algae. And here's the thing, the reason they're the pioneer species is because they can survive without soil. And in fact, they eventually break down things like rock to make soil. And that leads to the next stage of ecological succession within primary succession, where small plants and shrubs come in, and then larger plants come in, and then trees come in, and so on and so forth. And so you need to remember that the pioneer species for primary succession, lichen, moss, algae. For secondary succession, the pioneer species is going to be small grasses and plants because, again, there's already soil there, so grasses can survive. Next, you need to know the end of succession. The climax stage is the end of succession. It is the final chapter. Once you've gotten to the climax stage of succession, that means that there generally won't be another stage until there's another natural disaster or disruption that resets it to primary succession or secondary succession once again. And climax forests are really old forests that are in their climax stage. They're no longer going to undergo succession until something disrupts them. Yeah, and that was it, guys, the review for Unit 2 of AP Environmental Science. Hopefully this was helpful, and if it was, please like this video. That way I'll keep making more of these so that hopefully it'll help you out even more. And comment down below if there's any other courses you want me to make review videos for. Have a wonderful day. Subscribe if you want to get notified when I next post a video. Bye!